Colors play a vital role in making a web page. By default, all the HTML elements you add inside your web pages appear in either black or white. But by addition of colors inside the document, you can add a lot of visual interest to your page, and CSS makes it easy for you to customize the colors of your own liking and assign them to the elements. And that's what we are going to learn in this section. Various places where you can apply color are the foreground color, that is the text color, background color of the elements, border color, text decorations, caret color, shadow or box shadow color, outline color, and much more. We will learn different ways or methods to assign color values such as RGB, hexadecimal, or HSL in detail. So let's dive into this colorful section, that is using colors with CSS. So far we have seen giving the color to the elements by using the keywords, that is the color names. Now let's discuss another method of giving color to the elements, which is by using the RGB values. Let's first understand what RGB is. RGB stands for red, green, and blue, which are three hues of light that can be mixed together for creating various colors. This method, that is combining red, green, and blue light, is the standard method for producing color images which you see on your television, smartphone, or desktop screens. Now let's take a look at few practical examples for RGB values. First, I will define a paragraph inside the body and will apply the styling after that. Now let's give few styling to the body. Next, I'll apply color property to the paragraph. I'll say RGB and you can see the value here. I'll press enter. By default, it contains these values, that is red, green, and blue. The number of colors supported by RGB depends on how many possible values can be used for red, green, and blue respectively. This is known as color depth, which is measured in bits. The number of bits indicates how many colors are available for each pixel. For example, in black or white image, only 2 colors are needed. This means the color depth of the image is 1 bit. The most common color depth is 24-bit color, also known as true color. It supports 8 bits of each of the 3 colors, that is 8 bits of red, 8 bits of green, and 8 bits of blue, making 24 bits in total. That's why in 24-bit color the RGB value ranges from 0 to 255. In RGB, you will have to pass numeric values between 0 to 255. 0 means zero saturation, that is the color is absent, and 255 means 100% saturation of that color. So if I give 255 in red and rest I keep 0, you can see that the paragraph color changed to red. Now internally it looks something like this, where we have 3 layers, that is red, green, and blue on the default black layer. Right now, as the value of red is set to 255, which is at maximum saturation, and the green and blue are set to 0, which is zero saturation, hence only the red color is being displayed. Similarly, if I give 255 to green and rest I keep 0, you can see the green color getting displayed on the paragraph. Similarly for blue as well. Now let's say if I lower the value of red to 150 and rest I keep 0. You can see it got a bit darker because now the layer of red has less saturation compared to the max saturation. Let me give a proper RGB value. I'll give 218 for red, 165 for green, and 32 for blue. And you can see it generates a yellow-like color. So this is how the RGB value works. If you wish to change the opacity of the color, you can add an additional keyword, that is A, to the RGB value. A stands for alpha, that is the opacity of the final color and not any individual red, green or blue color. So if I give 0.7 as opacity, you can see the opacity getting changed. You can also give percentage values as well, like if I give here 40% instead of 0.7, the opacity is still getting affected. So this was all about using RGB values for applying colors to the elements. Let's talk about some basic questions. The first is, how do you define RGB color in CSS? So to define the RGB color for any element, you have to use the following syntax. You give RGB and inside these brackets you give 3 values for red, green and blue, which is ranging from 0 to 255. The next question, why does RGB values go till 255 only? So as discussed in RGB, each channel, that is red, green and blue, is of 8 bits. Thus it limits the range of 0 to 255. That's why the minimum and maximum value you can give in RGB is 0 and 255. So total is 256. That is 8 bits. Hexadecimal notations in CSS is a way of representing a hexadecimal or a hex value of color. This is the widely used way to specify colors in CSS. Hex values are actually just a different way to represent RGB values. Instead of giving 3 values between 0 to 255, you use 6 hexadecimal numbers. Hex value is always given between 0 to 9 and A to F, where A is equal to 10, B is 11, C is 12 and so on, prefixed by the hash sign. When styling an element with CSS, you will often change the color code values for properties like font color, background color, border color, etc. To create custom colors, you can use combinations of the hexadecimal numbers as shown earlier. So the correct way to define a hex code is, it must start with a hash sign followed by 6 digits of hexadecimal value. Each pair of 2 digits represents red, green and blue, so the pattern will look like this. Thus the colors are represented in the combination of red, green and blue values. Let's talk about values which are used in hexadecimal notations. The lowest value is 00, which is the darkest version of the color, that is closest to black, and the highest value FF is the lightest version of the color, that is closest to white. For example, if I want to give color to a paragraph, first I will define a paragraph inside the body. Now, just like we saw in the RGB, 0 means 0 saturation and 255 means maximum saturation. So if I want to give red color using hex value, I will give hash FF to the first pair, which is red, and the rest I'll keep 0. And you can see this gives the red color. Hex values are not case sensitive, so if I write this code in uppercase instead of lowercase, you can see it still shows the red color. But you should always follow a strict syntax rule while writing the hex code, whether you keep them in all upper or lowercase. Ideally, we see people using the lowercase often. Okay, so moving on, to give green and blue color, the values will be like this. Or you can use the shorthand notations for the same. This 3-digit shorthand is where you combine the duplicate digits from each color component into one, where R represents red component, G represents green and B represents blue component. For example, if I give a color code like this where I say hash FF AA44, you can see every color component has duplicate value. So if I reduce the duplicate values, the code becomes hash F, A and 4. which still gives the same color. So to convert a 6-digit code into 3, simply reduce the duplicate values from each color component. So by changing the amount of red, green and blue, you can create a variety of colors. Like here, if I give hash 31D2A4, it's going to create a shade closer to green, which you can see. Further, if I wish to add an alpha value, that is the opacity or transparency to the color, the format of hex code will be like this, where the last pair denotes the opacity of the color, which is also a hex value. So if I give 95 here, you can see the opacity getting changed. Let me change it to E4 instead of 95 and you can see again the opacity is changed. So lowering the value will cause the visibility to become fainter and fainter until it becomes transparent, and increasing the value will cause the visibility to become more and more opaque. Now let's talk about relative questions. So how do you assign color using hex value shorthand notations? By giving a 3-digit hex value code for colors, that is, when a normal 6-digit hex value contains duplicate color component values, we can reduce those duplicate values and convert the 6-digit hex code into a 3-digit hex code for that color. And this does not affect the color, that is, the color will remain the same. The next question is, how is the hexadecimal value calculated, or how does the hexadecimal color work in CSS? As we know, the hexadecimal base is 16, so the color range is from 0 to 9 and A to F. Suppose we have an RGB color in which the amount of red, green and blue is 69, 16 and 182. Now as the base value is 16 for hexadecimal, each value in RGB is divided by 16. So 69 divided by 16 gives quotient as 4 and remainder as 5. So the hex value for red 69 becomes hash 45. Similarly, dividing 16 with 16 gives quotient as 1 and remainder as 0. So the hex value of green 16 becomes hash 10. And by dividing 182 with 16, the quotient will be 11 and remainder will be 6, making the hex value of blue as hash 116. But as we have alphabets denoting the numeric values from 10 to 15, the value 11 becomes B. So the hex value of RGB 69, 16 and 182 will be hash 45 10 B6. This is how the hex values are calculated. The HSL, which stands for hue, saturation and lightness, is a CSS function which allows you to provide colors by specifying hue, saturation and light components of the color. The HSL model is very easy to use and understand compared to the RGB color model, because the HSL model allows you to select a base hue and then adjust its saturation and lightness as desired. Just like we saw in RGB, the HSL function accepts the HSL values as parameters. It takes up to 3 values, that is, the first value will be considered as hue, second as saturation and third as lightness, each separated by a comma. Alright, so let's break down the values. First is the hue. It can be easily identified by looking at this color wheel. Starting from 0th degree till 359, the different colors are applied. That is, the saturation of one color decreases and the next color's saturation increases. Here 0 degree is red, 120 degree is green and 240 degree is blue. If we talk about 60 degree, for example, it is 50% of red, 50% of green, which is represented as yellow. Similarly, 300 degree is 50% of blue and 50% of red, which represents magenta. All these values are represented as different angles inside the color cycle of the hue component. So you can either give values as an angle in degrees, for example 230 degree, or just the number 230 itself. The second value, that is saturation, is represented in percentage. It represents the amount of saturation given to the color. For example, 100% saturation is fully saturated, that is more colorful and intense, while the 0% is no opacity of hue. Finally, the third value, that is the lightness. Just like saturation, the lightness is also given in percentage value. So the 0% lightness means black and 100% is white. To understand lightness, we can visualize a bar where the gradient starts with black at 0% and ends at 100% with pure white. And this gradient passes through the color obtained with the given H and S values. Alright, so let's apply colors using HSL function. I'll start by defining a paragraph inside the body. Now in the style, I'll select paragraph and I'll define the color property to it. I'll write HSL and press enter, and you can see it shows me the hue, saturation and lightness. I am giving hue as 30 degrees, saturation as 100% and lightness as 50%. So it gives me an orange-like color. Now let's say if I tweak the saturation a little bit, I'll make it 70%. You can see it gives me a different shade of orange. What you can make out of this, that unless you change the hue of the color, changing the saturation and lightness will give you different shades of the given hue. And if I change the hue, let me make it 330, you can see it gives me entirely a different color. So changing the saturation and lightness will help you to set different version of the given hue. Once you have picked your hue, it's just a matter of adjusting the saturation and lightness until you get it right. Lastly, if you wish to add opacity, you can use the HSLA function and you can set up the alpha value. Like here you see, when I give 0.7, you have a different opacity. So now let's talk about an assignment. Create a circle shape and assign rainbow colors using HSL color value. Alright, so first to define a shape, I'll create a blank division inside the body. And now all the magic that remains will be done inside the CSS. So let's move to the styling part. I'll first change the background color of the body. Next, I'll style the div. I'll give width and height 200 pixels, margin top 120 pixels, padding 110 pixels. We cannot see the div right now because we haven't applied any color to it. So let's apply the colors. I'll give the background property, and the value which I'll use here is linear gradient function. This function sets a linear gradient as the background image, and to create a linear gradient we must assign 2 or more colors to it. So let's give the colors. We will learn about gradients used in CSS in absolute details, as that's going to be our next topic. Alright, after giving linear gradient function, the first value it takes is the angle. So I will give about 90 degrees and then I'll start defining the colors. So you can see the div now. Right now it's a square. Let's change the radius so it becomes circular. I'll give border radius to 50% and you can see it is a circle. Lastly, we have to align the div to center and it is empty. We cannot use the text align property. So I will have to use the margin property to align it. I'll first set the position as absolute then the margin left and margin right to auto. Also, I'll give left and right as 0. Both these properties, that is left and right, are used only when the element has a position property assigned to it. And now you can see we have achieved our final result. Up till now, we have seen the opacity used with RGB, HSL, and hexadecimal values and how it affects the colors. There is a property called opacity which is used to set the transparency for an element. It was introduced in CSS3 to enable the developers to set the transparency of any HTML element. The opacity property controls how opaque an element is on the scale of 0 to 1, that is 0.0 to 1.0. Lower the value, more transparent the element becomes. So let's try to set the opacity of an element using this property. I will first define an image tag inside the body. I'll give src alternative title in case of image fails to load, and I will also set width about 500 pixels, and you can see the image getting displayed. Alright, let's set the opacity. I'll give image selector, and inside I'll define the opacity about, let's say, 1, that is 1.0 internally. This is the maximum opacity you can give to any element. So this is how the syntax looks. You define the property and then you specify the alpha value, that is the amount of transparency which should be applied to any element. Now let's try to lower it. I'll give 0.6 and you can see the opaqueness of the image getting lighter. So the opacity property is used to make an image transparent by lowering the opacity value. The lowest value you can give is 0, that is 0.0. That will make your image fully transparent, as you can see. You can also give opacity to the text, like for this paragraph. If I try to give opacity to 0.5, then you can see the text's opacity being adjusted. If you want to be more precise, that is a value between 0.5 and 0.6, you can add precision by adding one more decimal value where I say 0.55. Generally, this is not the correct approach of giving opacity. Particularly to the text, we embed the opacity with the color property values, that is RGBA, HSLA, or hexadecimal notations with alpha value. Just like declaring the background of an element to be a solid color, in CSS you can declare that background to be a gradient. Instead of giving an actual image for a background, declaring gradients is better for control and performance. Gradients are typically one color that fades into another, but in CSS you can control every aspect of it, like from giving the direction to the colors, as many as you want, till controlling the color changes. You can control it all. So let's begin with the linear gradient function. This function allows you to give a linear gradient to any element. The gradient you apply will blend from one color to the next like this. In linear gradient, the gradient line can go upwards, downwards, left, right, or diagonal. Let's see implementation of linear gradient function practically. I'm going to define an empty article tag and will apply gradient to it. Let's apply the gradient. I'll write article here and inside I'll give some margin and padding. Now the linear gradient function can be applied with any properties which deal with background of the elements like background image, background, border image, etc. But it cannot be used with color properties, that is color or background color, as the gradient belongs to the image data type. They can only be used where images can be used. Though you can also give gradients to the text, but that is a different concept which we will cover as we move along. Okay, so I will give background property here and linear gradient function. First, let me define two colors so that we can know how the default gradient looks. You can see it creates a gradient in a single straight line, which is by default to bottom direction. So if I set the direction here to bottom, you can see there is no change happening. Linear gradient function takes all these positional or directional keyword values prefixed with to. So if I give to right instead of to bottom, you can see the change in gradient direction changes to the right. If I change it to left, the gradient direction changes to the left. If I change it to bottom left, the gradient goes to the bottom left corner. So this is how you can control the direction of the gradient with keyword values. Instead of giving directions like this, you can directly specify the angle. For example, if I give an angle to the gradient line 55 degrees, then the gradient will shift towards that angle, as you can see. Also, you can give the gradient in the reverse direction by giving a negative number to degree. Let's give minus 55 degrees. And why only two colors? Let's add few more color values to this gradient, and you can see how the gradient adjusted as another color was added. If I change the angle to 108 degrees, the gradient line will change accordingly. Let's reset to 0 degree. You can also customize your gradient by adding color stop points on the gradient line. A color stop position can be defined by giving length or percentage value to the color, which will affect the transition of the gradients. So here if I add color stop positions 10, 40, 60 and 90%, you can see the gradient transition getting changed. So this is how you can control the transition by giving color stop positions. For RGB values, the color stop positions are defined this way. So now let's talk about questions. First is, what are color stops in CSS gradient? Color stops are specific positions on the gradient line which tells the browser where to stop the gradient transition. They are basically used to render the colors with smooth transitions. It consists of the color value followed by an optional stop position, which can be in percentage or length value. The next question is an assignment where you have to create the following pattern using linear gradient function. So let's begin. We already have the article tag defined, so let's continue with that. I'll clear out the styles defined in article, then I'll define padding 12 em for top, left, right and bottom. Next I'll give linear gradient, so I'll write background and linear gradient. I'll give 135 degrees, which will define a color, and I'm adding a transparency effect by giving transparent, and stopping point I'm setting it to 25%. You can see the gradient at the top left corner. This is how we will be creating a diamond pattern with linear gradient. That is by applying gradient to the corners until it creates a diamond shape. So I will copy this linear gradient function and paste it 3 more times. I'll change the angle to 225 degrees, 315 and 45 degrees. And now you see it makes a diamond shape. Now this is where applying the color stop will help. Let me give 30% to the first gradient, and you can see how it changed the top left corner. I'll give 30% as color stop position to all the remaining gradients. And finally, if you wish to change the color, you can give background color, and we have achieved the pattern, so your assignment is done. The radial gradient is where colors gradually emerge from a single point and smoothly spread outward in a circular or elliptical shape. While as we saw in linear gradient, the colors were getting blended on a linear line. So let's understand the syntax and use of radial gradients by practical implementation. Let's start by defining basic radial gradient. I'll create an empty division And for the styling, I'll give padding and margin to the div. I'll define radial gradient function in background property. So let me give background here and radial gradient function. I'll define three colors with color stop points. I'm giving 20% and 50% to the first two colors. And you can see the elliptical gradient. This is what the basic radial gradient looks like. The first color which you define will start from the center of the element and fades towards the next color until it reaches the edge of the element. The fade happens at an equal rate no matter which direction. Right now, as the element is not a square, an elliptical gradient is created. But with a square, you can see a perfect circular gradient. So if I add equal width and height to the div, along with some left margin to set it around the center, you can see now it shows the circular gradient. Depending on the shape, the radial gradient is created. But if you still wish to create a circular gradient, no matter the element's shape, you can add the circle keyword before the color. First, let me remove the width, height and left margin as well to bring the default shape back. You can see the ellipse in the output. Now I will give circle here, and now you can see the ellipse is a circle irrespective of the element's shape. You can notice that the gradient fades all the way to the ending color. If we need this circle to be entirely within the element, we have to add a keyword, closest side. Now this will give you a precise circular gradient as the fade ends when it reaches the closest side of the element. You can either give it to ellipse or circular. Just like the closest side, you can give closest corner, farthest side or farthest corner to any radial gradient. Now that you have an idea about how the circle and the ellipse look, let's get into positioning. By default, both ellipse and circle are centered horizontally and vertically in their container. In other words, at 50-50%. The important thing to notice here is that the positioning happens from the center of the circle or ellipse. So if we position it to top left, the center point will be positioned. So if I want to set the center point of the gradient to top left, I will write at top left. This is the syntax of giving position to any radial gradients. We specify the position by prefixing the positional value with at keyword. If you want circular gradient, you can add the circle keyword with the position value, and you can see how the gradient shape gets shifted. So this is how you can define a radial gradient for any element. Now let me give you an assignment. Using the radial gradient, create the following pattern using red, green and blue colors. We already have the div. Let's start applying the styles. I'll give padding 170 pixels, margin top 5 em, margin left 5 em, width and height the same as 50 pixels and border radius 50%. Next, I'll give radial gradient inside the background property. I want to keep it circular, so I will give circle keyword at 50% space 0. Instead of giving the positional keyword values, you can give the custom position by setting the horizontal position and vertical position. So here the first value, that is 50%, is horizontal position and 0 is the vertical position. I will separate it by comma and will define two colors, one with full opacity and other with zero opacity. So it will create a shade like gradient when I give a stopping position to this color. I'll keep it around 60%. Now you see that red gradient is displayed. We'll need two more gradients to create the pattern, so let me give comma here and define another radial gradient. I will keep the horizontal position to 5% and vertical to 75. Giving two colors again. I'll keep the stop position same as above. Again giving comma, radial gradient, setting the horizontal position to 95% and vertical to 75. giving colors, and here as well. I'll keep the stop position same, that is 60%. Now the pattern looks very dark because it's just the gradients that have created this pattern. We haven't given any actual color to the background, so to make it bright, I will add a bright color to the background. Let me give white, and we have created the pattern just like we wanted. The conic gradient function creates a gradient that is rotated around the center of the element. It is similar to radial gradient and uses the center of the element as their source point. In conic gradient, the colors get spread equally around the center point, as you can see. The color which is getting generated in radial gradient emerges from the center of the element, while in conic gradient, the color is placed around the element from the center. The gradient rotates from 0 degree to 360 degree by default. So let's check this gradient practically. I will define an empty div inside the body and will apply the gradient on this division. So let's move to the styling part. I will give margin 3 em, padding 10 em and border radius to 50%. Next, I'll define the background property for giving the conic gradient function. I'll define two colors here and you can see the gradient. By default, it will be at 0 degrees. They are named as conic gradient because they tend to look like a cone that is being viewed from the top. In conic gradients, the color transitions around the center of the element, that is, starting from a position and going clockwise around the center, while in radial gradient, the color transition is from the center and then it spreads outwards in all directions. Similar to radial gradients, the conic gradient syntax provides positioning the center, that is the origin of the gradient, anywhere within or even outside the element. By default, the position of the origin point is 50-50 in percentage. Let me change it to 40 and 30%. You can see now the center point has changed. You can also specify angle, like here I give from 60 degrees. So you see that the origin is shifted and rotated to 60 degrees. If we do not specify an angle for the colors and color stop positions, then it is assumed that the gradient is evenly divided between the colors, starting and ending at 0 degree or 360 degree. Now that creates a kind of hard stop where the colors bump right up to one another at 0 degree or 360 degree. We can set the starting color and ending color as the same to avoid the color bump. That creates a smoother gradient and we start to get that cool cone looking perspective. Let me also give color stop positions. I'll give 20, 60 and 100%. Now you see how the colors get transitioned. One more value you can specify for the color is the turn value. Turns are new in CSS3 and mean a rotation. One turn is equal to 360 degrees. Note that turn is singular and there is no space between the number and its unit. So for example, if I give 0.4 turn, that is 144 degrees here, then the color transition will be completed in the area which gets covered in a 0.4 turn. Remaining area will be filled by the last color stop. So let me add color stops by adding turn values. You can see the color covers the area which gets included in one whole turn. If you set the value more than one turn, then the color transition will spread up to the turns specified. But visually we can only see 360 degrees, so we will not be able to see the colors that go beyond one complete turn. You can also give angle measurements like radian or gradian. If I give 2.5 radian here, a rad or radian is equal to 180 by pi degrees or about 57.3 degrees. An angle of 1 radian on a circumference of a circle creates an arc with an equal length to the radius of the circle, whereas the gradient is equivalent to 1 by 400, that is 0.0025% of a full circle. Similar to degrees, a positive gradient value will go clockwise and a negative value goes counterclockwise, and a 100 gradient will be at a 90-degree angle. So this is what the syntax of defining a conic gradient looks like. Let's talk about a relative question, that is explain a practical usage of conic gradient with CSS, or this can be an assignment that apply gradient overlay on the image. There are many practical uses of conic gradient function, like you can apply conic gradient on the text or on the background, or create an element using only conic gradient, etc. But most commonly they are used as an overlay on the images as to make them look aesthetically pleasing. So in this assignment I'll be showing you how to give a gradient overlay on the image. So I'll define a division with a class name overlay gradient, as I'll be applying conic gradient on this division, and inside I'll define an image tag giving the source in src, giving an alternate name to the image. You can see the image, it's quite big right now. Let me set its width and height. I'll give 550 pixels and height 300. To apply an overlay of gradient on the image, the ideal way is to use after pseudo element, as we already know that it creates a separate space for the content in which you can give special effects for that content. So I will write dot overlay gradient and giving the after pseudo element here. I'll keep the content blank, setting the position to absolute, keeping top and left to 0. I also want to keep the width and height of the gradient as the image, so I will give 550 pixels and height 300. Now let's give the conic gradient and then we will try to adjust it on the image. I'll give background property conic gradient and giving 2 colors. To adjust the gradient on the image, I'll just give margin property. Let me set it to 8 pixels. Alright, so you can see the gradient is perfectly settled on the image. Now it's time to make it blend with the image so it will look more natural. For that I'm using the property called mix blend mode. This property will blend the gradient with the image. There are various options available, as you can see. I'll choose overlay and you can see how beautiful and natural the gradient blends. Alright, so the gradient is applied and you can clearly see the issue, that is the vertical line. We need to apply some values that will remove this line. So if I keep the vertical position of the origin 0%, that will do the job. Let me set the position as 50% and 0%. And you can see our problem is solved. If you want to see the before and after effect, let me add a hover pseudo class here. And now you can see when I hover the mouse cursor on the image, it shows me the gradient effect. So this is how you create an overlay gradient for an image, and that's the practical use of this particular function.